you don't know what you've got till it's gone. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Joni Mitchell is a Canadian singer-songwriter who captured the hopes and fears of an entire generation.
Charge the people $1.50 just to see them.
Joni Mitchell is not just a great female singer-songwriter. She's a great singer, she's a great songwriter, and she happens to be female.
Put up a parking lot.
Joni Mitchell is a 70s folk icon and I think one of the greatest poets and songwriters of all time.
Roberta Jean Anderson was born on November the 7th, 1943 in Fort Macleod, Alberta, Canada.
Joni Mitchell was an only child and her father was in the Air Force and that meant that they moved around a lot. Her mother Myrtle was a teacher and they gradually moved from small town to small town.
There was just one train that used to go past a day and Joni would be there waving at it as it went past, so a really quiet corner of the world.
As a very young girl, Joni Mitchell was really athletic. She was obsessed with sports. But then at the age of 9, she contracted polio. And then later she would contract chickenpox, she would contract measles, and the measles almost killed her. And after that, it meant that she became quite a sickly child.
Joni's family eventually settled in Saskatoon, which she considers to be her real home. However, she didn't really fit in with formal education and was a bit of a free thinker.
She did have an English teacher who encouraged her to write poetry, encouraged her to express herself, and I think that was the beginnings of seeing that you could actually lead an artistic life.
As the popularity of country music grew, Joni decided that she wanted to play the guitar.
Because her joints were not as they should be because of her earlier bout of polio, then she used special open tunings, and these tunings meant that she sounded differently.
In 1964, Joni began her career as a professional musician, so she was playing at local clubs and festivals, and also taking a $15 a week job at a local coffee shop where she sang what she described as long, tragic songs in a minor key.
She saw Buffy Sainte-Marie. She got inspired and she took a 3-day train journey to Toronto.
It was on this train journey that Joni wrote her first song, Day After Day.
When she got to Toronto, she realised that the scene was very much based on covers rather than original songs. Unfortunately, the way to get ahead in the Toronto folk scene was to take songs by other people and make them your own. But the songs that she wanted to do had been taken by other people already. So the only way that she could progress was by writing her own songs.
In late 1964, Joni discovered that she was pregnant by her ex-boyfriend. This was a huge, huge influence on her life because deciding that she couldn't look after the baby when it was born in 1965, and also with there being quite a serious social stigma about mothers having babies born out of wedlock, she actually gave the child up for adoption.
And I think it cast a massive, massive shadow over her, but I also think it was a huge spur to creativity. She said that because she knew that she had this daughter who she couldn't have a relationship with, she had to have a relationship with the world.
In 1965, she met Chuck Mitchell, who was an American folk artist from Detroit. After a courtship that lasted about 36 hours, they decided to get married.
Joni married Chuck Mitchell and took his name and kept his name, of course, for the rest of her career, but their marriage only lasted a couple of years.
Joni moved to the Chelsea district of New York and began touring up and down the East Coast. It was at one of her shows in Florida that she met ex-Byrds member David Crosby.
David Crosby was immediately struck by her appeal as a musician, took her back to Los Angeles, where she met Elliot Roberts, who would become her manager.
Elliot Roberts was almost like the puppet master of the entire Laurel Canyon scene. Very, very important figure. Joni Mitchell was now under his wing, and David Crosby was telling everyone that he could about this incredible singer he'd discovered.
He managed to convince David Geffen to allow Joni Mitchell in 1968 to record her debut solo acoustic album, Song to a Seagull.
There's a man who's been out sailing in a decade full of dreams, and he takes her to a schooner and he treats her like a queen.
David Crosby wanted Joni Mitchell to sound as natural and atmospheric as possible, and his idea was to get her to sing into the strings of a grand piano and then pick up the kind of resultant reverberation and sound on microphones around the room, which it sounds like a really interesting idea, but actually in practice wasn't very good at really achieving the right quality of sounds needed to show what Joni's voice was like. And so what happened was, in post-edit, they had to fiddle with it and kind of boost everything. And the result of this is the album actually sounds quite flat because it's been processed so much.
By Paul Rothchild, who produced a lot of the Doors records, so it sounded good.
Clouds had a couple of Now standards. It had Chelsea Morning and Both Sides Now.
Which is probably her best and best known song, even now.
I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow it's life's illusions. I recall, I really don't know life.
She was introducing a kind of, it's not even exactly hippie, it's more a sort of simplicity and a purity. She had a very sophisticated musical approach, but it was also a simple musical approach.
Joni Mitchell's third album, Ladies of the Canyon, sees her move into a much more mainstream, radio-friendly sound. She's really experimenting with bringing in different instruments. It's not just her and a guitar anymore. And there's some pop hits on it.
Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
With Ladies of the Canyon, which amazingly went top 10 in Britain, as well as top 30 in the United States, she was expanding her musical horizons. There was brass on this album. There was much more adventurous arrangements.
This was really when Joni Mitchell became the sort of the voice of the late 60s generation, because you had Big Yellow Taxi, which is a very early song about environmentalism, you know, pave paradise, put up a parking lot. And then you have Woodstock. Well, Joni Mitchell didn't make it to Woodstock. She wasn't there. She wrote that song in a hotel room. But it became the defining anthem of not just Woodstock, but of the whole era.
We are stardust, we are golden, and we got to get ourselves back to the garden.
Because of her relationships with David Crosby and then Graham Nash, Joni Mitchell was becoming the queen of Laurel Canyon, which was the centre of that American folk West Coast scene. She was also becoming the songwriter, the chronicler of these people and this scene.
Joni Mitchell's fourth album, Blue, is very emotional and very much wearing her heart on her sleeve. And this has come off the back of some very intense relationships. Also her final kind of breakup with James Taylor, and a relationship that she thought was forever. She thought she'd found her soulmate, and apparently she was devastated when he ended it.
Hey Blue, there is a song for you to ink on a pen underneath the skin.
It was very, very confessional. It had This Flight Tonight on it, and it had Little Green, the song which alluded to the birth of her daughter, which nobody, apart from her very, very immediate circle.
On Blue was absolutely from the heart and absolutely, you know, coming from, I think, a period of great personal pain. All of that poured into this incredible album, which really is her masterpiece.
You're in my blood like holy wine. It tastes so bitter and so sweet. Oh, I could drink a case of you, darling.
At this point, she was making the suggestion that if I tell you what these songs are about, then they won't be about you anymore. And you could read into every song that Blue was about you, the listener. And that's her genius.
After the fame that Blue brought her, Joni retreated to the Canadian wilderness, living in isolation for a year, resulting in the 1972 album For the Roses.
Joni Mitchell's fifth album, For the Roses, has what was considered her first hit single. You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio was actually written quite sarcastically by Joni when she was asked by the record label to write a song for the radio. So she did, thinking she was being quite funny, but actually it was a hit.
Oh, honey, you turn me on. I'm a radio. I'm a country station. I'm a little bit corny.
Turn Me On, I'm a Radio was a major hit. And so this was really Joni Mitchell's most commercially successful period, and it led to Court and Spark.
Joni Mitchell decided she wanted to make a clean break from her folk past. She employed this jazz fusion band, LA Express, and they recorded this amazing album and they took it out on tour across the US and Canada, and the reviews were amazing.
Court and Spark was Joni Mitchell's most successful album, commercially speaking. It reached #2 in the United States, and it was the longest that she'd ever taken to record an album, and it showed. It was really detailed, it was incredibly layered.
Court and Spark was actually nominated for 4 Grammys, winning 1. For Best Arrangement, Instrumentation and Vocals.
She was really at the height of her popularity, you know, strangely having become this icon of the folk generation. She was now a very successful jazz musician.
Help me, I think I'm falling in love again. When I get that crazy feeling, I know I'm in trouble again.
LA Express appeared on a lot of Joni Mitchell records, but after Court and Spark, they became her live backing band. And these concerts, they were mostly terrific, but Joni Mitchell was quite unsatisfied with them because her music was so intimate and so personal. She felt that playing arenas and massive halls wasn't the right way to push things forward. So from that point, she made a conscious decision, not so much to sell records, but just to go her own way.
I think what's really interesting with Joni Mitchell is she's never happy to just settle and do the same thing album after album. She's a real pioneer, she's pushing forward. And when we get to Hissing of the Summer Lawns, she's really quite ahead of her time. You know, this is in the mid-70s and she's starting to embrace African culture and different world music.
And there's a song called Jungle Line, which has got a very early example of sampling, because she has this drum section from the drummers of Burundi.
There's Burundi drumming on it. There's in France, they kiss on the main street. And there's a suggestion that Joni Mitchell is really, really on top of her musical game. She's going the way that she wants. So there's a big jazz influence. There's a big African influence. When these things weren't trendy or expected, and there's no wonder that Prince regarded it as one of the great albums of all time, because you can hear a lot of the things that he was trying to do on his albums.
In 1976, Joni released Hejira, an album that was mostly written in her car whilst driving from New York to California.
Joni has said that she felt that a lot of her other songs she felt like other people could have recorded, but actually Hejira was the collection of songs that were very much her and all about what she did as a musician and a lyricist.
And I'll just be getting home with my reel-to-reel. There's no comprehending just how close to the bone and the skin and the eyes and the lips you can get.
I really love Hejira. I think it's a fantastic album. It's not exactly a jazz album, but she's working in a very, very different way. She recorded it with Jaco Pastorius, who is this virtuosic bass player.
The jazz influences are much more upfront than they ever were, but this is complicated music. It's music for grown-ups.
Wild Things Run Fast was Joni Mitchell's 11th studio album, and the first that she worked on with Larry Klein, the player who she actually married. And this is when Joni kind of, again, flips everything round, changes her direction, leaves jazz and becomes much more kind of 80s pop mainstream.
You just wanna go to a movie show and sit there holding hands, you're so square. Baby, I don't care.
Wild Things Run Fast was influenced by a trip that Joni took to the Caribbean, where she'd heard groups like Steely Dan, Talking Heads and The Police, and was influenced to make a more upbeat, drum-infused record, really returning to the pop music sensibilities of a couple of albums previously.
Yes, I do, I love ya. We're on the buildings above, I do.
The 1982 album, Wild Things Run Fast, was a very unusual album for Joni Mitchell. She'd met, fallen in love and married Larry Klein, who was her bassist and her producer. So it's incredibly upbeat. There's even a duet with Lionel Richie on it. And there's covers of Unchained Melody too. It's Joni Mitchell doing the closest that Joni Mitchell could ever come to making a pop album. And it's really rather good.
The Chinese cafe, we'd be dreaming on our dimes. We'd be playing, oh my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch.
Joni Mitchell took part in a huge performance of Roger Waters' The Wall at the Berlin Wall, alongside Cyndi Lauper, Bryan Adams and Van Morrison. And she sang one of the most beautiful songs on that album, which is Goodbye Blue Sky.
In 1994, Joni Mitchell released Turbulence Indigo, which really introduced her to a new generation of fans.
It was an incredibly sad record. And the day before she was due to begin recording it with Larry Klein as producer and bassist, then the couple split up and they moved to separate houses.
Soft emotions.
It is one of her more accessible albums, but the streak of sadness and melancholy that runs through it makes it, I think, one of her great albums.
Before it's too late. Think love awaits so you don't hold on. Oh, and then it's gone.
There are some big tracks on the record, so Sex Kills, Sunny Sunday, for example, and the album actually ended up winning 2 Grammys.
1988's Taming the Tiger would be Joni's last album of original material for almost a decade, as she went on to release reworks of her old songs in order to fulfill contractual obligations.
In 2007, Joni shocked the music world when rumours were confirmed that she had signed a deal with Starbucks Hear Music and was due to release an album, so she released Shine, which was actually her most successful album since Hajira over 30 years previously, as it got to number 14 on the Billboard chart.
Shine was a big surprise. You know, first of all, that it existed at all, but secondly, that she put it out through Starbucks, of all people. You know, this is Joni Mitchell, you know, the vanguard of the dispossessed and, you know, the sort of fighting the good fight against the corporate behemoths, and then puts out a record on Starbucks.
And it was a good record. There was another Grammy to be won, and she won it for Best Instrumental. And she went back to Big Yellow Taxi.
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, boutique and a swinging hot spot.
Joni Mitchell is clearly a 20th century great. It's partially her longevity, but it's also her lack of compromise. She's never sold out. She's just sold quite a few records.
She came of age in a male-dominated period, and she found a way to express herself through fairly straightforward music in a way that raised it on a similar bar to literature.
Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Everyone around her at that time in the 60s and 70s